Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I should point out that I did not receive the award from the American Society of Human Genetics while I was executive vice president there. I didn't give it to myself. So, but I was very grateful to have received it. I'm going to move very quickly because I have only a brief amount of time. I need to find out how to drive this. You have the device, great. Do I need to be licensed? Is it? Okay.
You're the man.
All right, thank you very much. So what you're going to hear from me today are two general categories of information. My own thoughts that have developed over the last 3 decades or so about what genetic literacy should be, but I'm going to intersperse that with some indications of how people have been working on genetic literacy at a variety of different levels. So let me get started. Oh, by the way, I also have a test for you along the way. And it's the reward is non-trivial. It's a Milky Way bar. There's only one person can win this, and I'll get to this in a second. So let's see. I guess I go this way. All right, so I'd like to try to do the following. I'm going to talk about 2 categories of genetic literacy and some concepts related thereto. I'm going to give you some examples of attempts to define genetic literacy. I'm going to talk a little bit about technology, an overlooked aspect of science literacy. I'm going to talk about personalized predictive precision and individualized medicine. This was a task that I got last week from the planning committee. So I haven't had a whole lot of time to think about this, but that's never kept me from expressing an opinion anyway, so we'll see what happens. And then I will talk a little bit about genetics and genomics. I might save that for the panel discussion. And then I want to emphasize the importance of the nature and methods of science as the most important aspect of science literacy and genetic literacy. Okay, so here are my 2 basic reasons to promote genetic literacy. One is to help us understand the history and nature of life on Earth. This is sort of basic biology. I think you need to have an understanding of genetics if you want to consider yourself a person who understands how life is structured on the planet and how it came to be, even though we don't have a complete answer to that. And certainly to understand the future of healthcare, including the important ethical, legal, and social aspects of healthcare and the genetic contributions to healthcare. Now, here's the question. This is my depiction of the single most important concept in genetics and genetic literacy for the public. What is it? Ladybugs. No. What's the underlying concept here? Sorry? Variation. Somebody said variation. Whoever said it wins the Milky Way. If somebody else said it, you can figure out how to divide it. That's an Elsie's issue on allocation of scarce resources. Okay. What did I do with my clicker? Oh, here it is, right here. Okay, so variation. So, to understand the history and nature of life on Earth, these are some things that I consider to be absolutely central concepts. Notice I'm focusing on concepts, not isolated pieces of information, right? Variation and continuity. I'm not going to read all of these things to you. Evolution and the relatedness of all species. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. But these are some very important concepts that are related to genetics and that I believe are central to understanding the history and nature of life on Earth. Now, genetics, of course, is the study of inherited biological variation. And that notion of inherited variation is absolutely critical, of course, to evolution. That was one of Darwin's central conceptual contributions to an understanding of life on Earth. The variation doesn't matter in a particular population unless it's inherited. It is essentially blind to selection unless it's capable of being transmitted. So variation is the rule, not the exception in the natural world. That is something that I believe all people should understand, especially high school and middle school and elementary school students, because they are more interested, in a sense, in typology. Many of them would like to be like everybody else rather than respecting and understanding variation in their own populations. Now, genetics also explains biological continuity, not just variation. Remember, it explains continuity between cells, between generations, within species across time and space, and of course, across species, which is evolution. Now, people have been thinking about genetics in schools for a long time. Here's a statement from 1963. I won't read it to you. This is a man who clearly spent a fair amount of time trying to teach genetics to kids with the materials available at that point. Now, since that point, there have been a number of efforts to expand upon our understanding of what should constitute genetic literacy and how we can insert those understandings into instructional materials and to teaching. So how many of you are familiar with the next-gen science standards, next-generation science standards? Well, they're being developed by the National Research Council, by the National Science Teachers Association, and by AAAS. And this is just one example of one excerpt from a high school standard for genetics. Notice that this is not focused on isolated pieces of information or on asking kids to memorize the stages of mitosis or meiosis. It's not asking them to describe the parts of the cell, to describe the parts of the structure of the DNA molecule. It is asking them to do fairly sophisticated intellectual tasks like make and defend a claim based on evidence that inheritable variations may result from the following. So this is just one example of attempts to establish some baseline of scientific literacy, in this case genetic literacy. Now, one can find indications of these central concepts of variation and continuity in interesting places. I'm going to show you two Girl Scout cookie boxes from the 1980s. I fully admit that it took me 6 or 8 boxes before I realized I had this important instructional device at my disposal. But here you have this lovely young woman saying, "I'm not like anyone else." Variation. And here we have a group of women saying, "We have a lot in common." Continuity and unity and diversity. Right? So these are concepts. Again, we're focusing on concepts here. Let's move for a second to introductory college biology courses. What I'm showing you here are some proposals for the components of genetic literacy at the undergraduate level. This was a project, you see the date here, 2002. We published this in 2002, we being the Education Committee of the American Society of Human Genetics, of which I was a member at the time. And we spent a lot of time talking about the central content areas for introductory biology for non-science majors. So notice again, we're focusing on major concepts here. Nature of genetic material, transmission, gene expression, gene regulation, evolution, genetics, and society. Now, we would have to elaborate in different ways on the content of each of these areas in 2016 differently than we did in 2002. For example, in looking at gene expression, we would have to consider a whole new range of findings about how gene expression happens and is regulated, including epigenetic information. But that's undergraduate biology. My colleague at the American Society of Human Genetics, Mike Doherty, published this very interesting paper in 2009 in our journal, where he said we really should flip the curriculum at the undergraduate level. And this is not, I'm not talking about flipped classes here. I'm talking about a completely different approach to the content, which is starting with quantitative traits, complex traits, rather than the way we usually start things, which is with single gene characters and Mendelian inheritance. It's a very interesting paper. I encourage you to take a look at it from our own journal. So again, another opportunity or another attempt to specify what genetic literacy should look like, in this case at the undergraduate level. Now, the second reason to understand genetics is, as I indicated earlier, to understand the future of healthcare. In my view, what we are moving to is a prevention-based healthcare system increasingly informed by genetic perspectives. This, and here we get to what I think is very important about precision medicine and the way it might play out. We're talking about a partnership here between healthcare providers and the public, especially if we're going to be focusing on prevention and focusing on complex traits. This has to be a partnership between the provider and the patient. And for those of you who are interested in genetic counseling in the room, we'll also see, I think, more and more of a shift away from the ethos of non-directive counseling toward more directive counseling as we focus on complex disease. If my healthcare provider, by the way, you don't have to take a formal genetic test, just do a family history, and you'll find out that I am at significant risk for heart disease. Right? If my healthcare provider knows that by doing the first genetic test, which is a good family history, there should be some direction coming from my healthcare provider. Get more exercise, eat right, don't drink as much Guinness as you drink. Okay. All of those things. It should be directive. And of course, genetics education for the public and health professionals should be complementary. We should be conveying the same messages in our educational programs about genetic contributions to health and disease as we're conveying to the public, obviously at different levels of detail, but they should be complementary. Here's another example of an attempt to elaborate genetic literacy for a category of health professionals, in this case, physician assistants. There are 6 categories in total that they took on: medical knowledge, the first 3 being medical knowledge, communication skills, and patient care. And you can go to the physician assistant's website and find these competencies for health professionals. So here are some central questions that we should struggle with, particularly when we're trying to educate health professionals about genetics and in fact, precision medicine. Which content is appropriate? And I am at pains when we're working on the education of health professionals to distinguish accurate from complete. Your educational content can be quite accurate, but not necessarily complete in the way you as a genetics professional would want to see it or understand it. It's not necessary to try to turn other health professionals into geneticists. Most of them, in fact, really don't want to be geneticists. But they need to have enough information to work effectively in a genetics context in their own clinics. So there's a difference between accurate and complete. And then we have to think about which clinical behaviors we want to change and whether we can do so. And then, of course, how do you define and measure success? This is a question that, unfortunately, we ask too late in the development of most educational programs. You should ask this question first, and the evaluators should be at the table with you so they know what your objectives are and they can help you design appropriate evaluations. As an educator over the years, I've learned to ask these 3 questions. What do we want the learner to know? What do we want him or her to value? And what do we want him or her to do as a result of an encounter with our educational intervention? Now, here's a modest proposal for you. I think we should be careful about the use of the terms genetic disorders and genetic disease. We in the genetics community like to say, we believe that genetics is the fundamental science of health and disease, that genes underlie all pathological processes ultimately. All health and disease. But then we keep talking about genetic disease and genetic disorders, and I think we send mixed messages. As if there is a category of disease for which there are genetic contributions and a category for which there are not. It's one of the reasons I like this definition of genetic counseling from the National Society of Genetic Counselors. It talks about the implications of genetic contributions to disease. Sometimes the genetic contributions are quite profound and quite salient, as in the single gene disorders that we know about. In other cases, there is a declining heritability, for example, with age in any given cohort. And so the role of the genes becomes less salient in late onset disorders, and the role of the environment becomes perhaps more important. So instead of talking about genetic disease and genetic disorders, we should think about conveying to the public how salient the genes are for any particular malady we're talking about. Okay. Now, here's where I'm getting into some new territory for me. I did find these definitions. I'm not going to read them to you, but you can see precision medicine, predictive medicine. I was struck, by the way, you see the question mark and the exclamation mark here. I was struck by the notion of preventing mortality. I think we may need to, I think that's I think that's not going to work. Um, Based on 3.5 billion years of the history of life on Earth, it's probably not going to work at this point. We might want to amend that by saying preventing early mortality or premature mortality, right? So these are the distinctions I found. Personalized medicine. Let me just say a little bit about this. We found at NCHPEG, the National Coalition for Health Professional Education in Genetics, when we talked to physicians about personalized medicine, they got a little testy because their response was, what do you think I've been doing? I personalize all of my interactions with patients. I don't meet with populations in my office. I meet with individuals. So I think we have to be careful how we couch these kinds of things for providers and for the public as well. I mean, it might be great to say to the public, we're trying to personalize your healthcare. I think that's wonderful. But be aware that clinicians think they're already doing this. Now, Barton Childs, one of my mentors from Johns Hopkins, and David Valley, another colleague from Hopkins, we constructed this definition a while back of individualized medicine, which, as it says here, is a way of thinking as contrasted with personalized medicine, which is a way of practicing. And our view of individualized medicine is that it incorporates these concepts of genetic variation and also notions of evolutionary context of disease and adaptive and disadaptive phenotypes in the context of the environment. And this really is a counterpoint to the notion of typological thinking, that there is a disease that's the same essentially for everyone. You've heard the old notion from Osler that the good physician treats the disease, the great physician treats the patient. It was Archibald Garrard, actually, who began to elaborate the biochemical individuality behind the ability to think about disease individually with each patient. Why does this patient have this disease at this point? And it is a counterpoint to typological thinking. So for me, individualized medicine is a way of thinking as contrasted with personalized medicine, which is a way of practicing. So I won't spend a lot of time on genetics and genomics here, but I really don't believe it's worth the time to try to distinguish the two for the public or for healthcare providers. They're confused enough by genetics. But I did want to point out, with my apologies to some colleagues from the Genome Institute in the room, that this definition that I find on the Genome Institute website, I believe is not correct either historically or currently. I mean, I have a textbook here by Kurt Stern from 1955 where he talks about multifactorial disease and the influence of multiple genes on the expression of phenotype in conjunction with the environment, producing quantitative variation in expression. So even 60 years ago, geneticists were thinking about multiple genes, and they still do. So I don't think this definition holds up. Now here's another distinction, science and technology, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about technology in a second. We developed these definitions at the Biological Sciences Curriculum Study in the early 90s, as you see. And we found these helpful as we were constructing educational programs to address these two different kinds of issues. Science proposes explanations, technology proposes solutions. AAAS, I think, did a very nice job of elaborating the principles of technology. I'm not going to go through these all for you here, but I think it is extremely important to include principles of technology in any construction of a program that's focused on science literacy. Most people do not encounter the underlying scientific constructs behind the healthcare regimes they're exposed to. They encounter the technology, and they have to understand what the technology is about in a broad sense. So I'm going to wrap up here pretty quickly. I did find this quote from the neuroscientist Sam Harris in his book, The Moral Landscape. There really is an epidemic of scientific ignorance. And I like his notion that it is deeply counterintuitive to think that empty space has structure or that we share common ancestors with other organisms. My concern is that the counterintuitive nature of scientific knowledge does leave the public susceptible to explanations that are more intuitive, but they're wrong. Creationism, for example. And the appearance of a designer when we look at the way life is organized on the planet. So this brings me to my final point, which is the most important aspect of scientific literacy. It is conveying to the public what science is as a way of understanding and explaining the natural world and how that differs from other types of explanations. What counts as evidence? Intellectual honesty. The notion that science strives to be authoritative but not authoritarian. I think these are extremely important concepts for understanding what science is and making decisions about what information you will act on. Now, there are lots of different ways besides science to explain the natural world. This is one from Ed Larson. I don't know if you can read that from where you are. Okay? That's one explanation for life on Earth. Here's an explanation for extinction. And I'll just finish with this, which is an indication of scientific approaches to different problems. Notice the distinction between a scientist and a normal person. Okay, that's it for me.